Let's compare major and minor scales and look at them a little more closely. Here we have our C major scale that we talked about in a previous video. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Standard C major scale. Now, interestingly, that if we look at the sixth note of the major scale, in this case, it's A, and we take all of the same pitches from that scale, just starting on A, we have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and A. You might remember this from the last video with the A minor scale. And this follows the A minor pattern. Whole, half, whole, whole, half, whole, whole. In fact, it follows the pattern of all minor scales in that way. So here we have a major scale, and here we have a minor scale, and they use the same pitches in the same order, except that this one starts on a different note. It's still the same pitches, it's still the same order, but the sixth note of this scale is the first note of this scale. Or you could even think of the third note of this scale is the first note of that scale. Scales that share the same collection of pitches are called relatives. Relative scales. And we'll notice that this pattern, whole, half, whole, whole, half, whole, whole, that pattern starting on the sixth note gives us the minor scale pattern. Or starting on the third note here, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. That gives us the pattern of the major scale. So relative scales or relative keys are scales or keys that share the same pitches. When we start talking about key signatures, you can also think about them sharing the same key signature. There's one other way to think about comparing scales, and that's by starting on the same note. So in this case, I have A minor starting on that note. But what if I make a major scale starting on the same pitch as I had my minor scale? I'm not going to follow my minor pattern. I'm going to follow my major pattern. So that's whole, whole step from B to C sharp. Now a half step, C sharp to D. Then whole, a whole step from E to F sharp. And then a whole step from F sharp to G sharp. And now a half step here. So I'm not using this pattern. I'm using the major scale pattern. Now, you'll notice I followed the major scale pattern. It did not produce the same as the A minor pattern, right? The different pattern produces different pitches, which is why it sounds different. You'll notice that this note is different, this note is different, and this note is different. The third, sixth, and seventh. This is another way of comparing two scales. Before, we looked at scales that shared all of the same pitches, but were in a different order, a different starting note. Now we're looking at notes that start on the same note, but have some different pitches in them. These scales are called parallel scales. Parallel scales start and end on the same pitch as each other. So in this case, both scales go A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A. But this has sharps on some, and that one doesn't. Another way to compare these two is that when I look at the major versus the minor, in the major, the third, the sixth, and the seventh are higher. In the minor, the third, the sixth, and the seventh are lower. So you can think of when comparing a major and minor, in relative terms, the major starts on one and the minor starts on the sixth note of the scale. In solfege, the major would start on do and the minor would start on la. When you're comparing parallel scales, you can think that the third, sixth, and seventh notes of the scale are different from each other. In major, they're higher than they are in minor. So knowing how these compare lets you draw connections from one scale to another, which can show you when music changes what scale it's using. It's often going to be changing between relative or parallel scales.